Good morning. My name is Tim Nourse, and I'm the president of Making Sense International. And it is my pleasure to welcome you all to the closing roundtable of today's Global Youth Economic Opportunity Summit, Collective Action for Youth-Centered Development Priorities. Today's agenda started from the ground up, with voices from our community who shared some of their first-hand experiences with the pandemic. We also heard from the Ford Foundation, Ripple Impact, the World Bank, and the Internet Society on the future of work and youth leadership, gender and workforce, and education, technology, and inclusion. Their remarks address some of the critical system-wide social and economic challenges facing young people that have been amplified by the pandemic. Our speakers also challenged us to think about youth-centered policies and investment that can have a real impact. As this morning's speaker, Dr. Rhonda Zeleny Green said when speaking about education, technology, and inclusion is not enough, and adaptation just enough to get by only masks the problem. We have a great lineup of speakers to help us explore this question, and I want to thank our longtime partner USAID for their support for the 2020 Summit and this roundtable session. Our moderator, Mike McCabe, is the Agency Youth Coordinator at USAID, and he's going to lead us in this discussion. Mike brings nearly 30 years of professional experience managing international development programs. In his current role, he's responsible for helping integrate youth engagement and youth development issues across the agency, oversee the youth policy implementation, and serve as a senior representative on youth issues in the interagency and external community. For those of you who know him, Mike is a tireless champion for young people and youth-centered policies at USAID. Mike, thanks again for joining us. The mic is yours.
Thanks so much, Tim, and congratulations to the whole Making Sense team. And welcome to everyone around the world participating in this final session of the 2020 Global Youth Economic Opportunity Summit. We seek to explore how we as a collective system of actors can best support policies advancing youth economic opportunity and development in the changing context of COVID-19. So what does all that we've discussed and learned have to say about where we want to go with this and how we need to structure ourselves differently in this new context? I'm currently reading Fareed Zakaria's new book, 10 Lessons for a Post-Pandemic World, which I highly recommend to all of you. Among its many important insights is how we're living in a world where the context is not one of getting back to where we were, such as recovering from loss of learning by youth around the world who lost a year of cognitive development, or the dramatic increase in extreme poverty and malnutrition. But rather, it's about realizing that the whole context has been somewhat and permanently transformed, both in good and in troubling ways. One example he highlights is how one of the leading employers in India, Tata, has moved over 400,000 workers to remote work and most likely won't go back to having them come back to work the way they were prior to the pandemic. Or how there have been over 1 billion telemedicine visits just in one country since the pandemic. We've literally transformed the way healthcare is working. I remember one of the young entrepreneurs that I got to meet about 2 years ago, Makia Jawad, who was the winner of the Global Youth Summit pitch competition for her work as a 25-year-old doctor in Pakistan, setting up an organization called Sehat Kahani, which is a telehealth platform connecting young women health workers to rural health clinics. And it was a completely self-sustaining model. She was before her time and now is positioned to make a dramatic impact in this new world that's been transformed by the pandemic. So if each of us is a part of the system, where do we see ourselves and our role in advancing the systemic agenda? If we can write a collective impact plan to advance youth economic opportunity in terms of policy and program in this new context, what do we need to commit to? What needs to happen if we really want to reimagine a system that supports young people? And how do we protect them against shocks and create new opportunities? So some of you have seen USAID Administrator Barsa's launch of our new Over the Horizon strategic planning results this week. Jennifer, who's with us, is one of our chief architects of the Over the Horizon strategy, and she'll share more on that. But I'm really excited because we have a panel with different perspectives on where we touch that system: donor, private sector, implementing partner advocate, young entrepreneur. Our excellent panel includes Kristin Lorde, who's the CEO of IREX and one of the chairs of the AIYD, the Alliance for International Youth Development. And she'll give her perspective on advocacy and policy and talk about the Youth and Consequences article that she and others put out in Brookings about how we put youth at the center of pandemic response. Then we have Nahom Teklu Bekele, who's a curator and a youth advisor and part of the Ethiopia effort around building youth entrepreneurship. And he'll talk about his work during this pandemic to pivot the way that young entrepreneurs are engaged in rebuilding. Jennifer Arangio is our senior advisor to the administrator at USAID, and she'll give her perspective on how the US government, as a funder of youth economic opportunity, can really pivot through the over the horizons response to COVID on youth economic opportunity. Jesse Muraya is the managing director at Pong Industries and Chamber of Commerce and Industry and Committee on Youth and Business in Kenya. And Jesse will talk about the business voice. What is the role of private sector in pandemic recovery through youth economic opportunity? And finally, we have Florencia Spangaro, who's the COO of the Citi Foundation and a member of the Youth Employment Funders Group. And she'll talk a little bit about that really tricky situation of how do we align our efforts across donors, across other key members of the system, especially through how we're doing it through the Youth Employment Funders Group. So each speaker's been asked to come with a few clear action items and recommendations that they'll share. However, we also know that the smartest person in this virtual room is the room, meaning all of you. So we've created a Padlet where we hope that you'll help us leverage the collective wisdom and the collective responsibility of everyone here. And I would ask that you get a sheet of paper right now or on your computer. You're ready to write down thoughts and questions and put it in an anonymous Padlet to help us advance around two key questions. One, what do you think are the most important social, technical, or policy actions we need to make right now to help advance a more inclusive, supportive system for economic opportunity in youth? And two, what do you think your role is inside of this system designed to support youth economic opportunities? What are you going to do? So let's kick it off and go to Kristin.
Fortunately, from the secondary effects of COVID-19, and that we ought to, as a global community, be putting youth at the center of our response. Youth are not the most prominent victims of COVID as a disease, a public health emergency, but they are suffering disproportionately from all of those secondary effects that I mentioned. And let me give you just a few examples. One in six young people has stopped working since the onset of the pandemic, and 42% have reported a reduction in their income. School closures are affecting so many youth around the world, up to 90% of the global youth population. 51% of youth believe their education will be delayed because of COVID, and 9% feel they may never complete their studies at all. And by the way, many of those are disproportionately women and girls. And then we also see ever more that youth want a voice and feel excluded. So we see youth pouring into the streets, whether it's in Nigeria or Thailand, Lebanon, Iraq. Youth want to have a voice, and COVID is only exacerbating or underscoring for them the fact that they feel left out of important decisions that affect them. But there were already these needs before COVID hit. Today's youth population is the largest youth population in human history. 1.2 billion youth worldwide. And an important point is that it hasn't peaked yet. We should expect to see the youth population reach 1.4 billion around 2065. And it's concentrated in the very poorest countries, and it's expected to go up 62% by 2050. We see that youth are often in the most fragile and stable regions where they're the largest populations. In the Sahel, for instance, 64.5% are below the age of 25. And across the entire subcontinent, there's a disconnect between young populations, the average age of an African being 19, and old leaders who tend to be an average of 70 or more. And even before the COVID crisis, a youth employment crisis was looming. So COVID is only exacerbating these trends. It is focusing our attention again. But we should have been looking before. As you'll see in this survey we did at Brookings, youth was seen as the most neglected or insufficiently resourced area of development when we asked leaders from international development organizations around the world. But also, and I want to emphasize this, one they're the most excited about. We have a real opportunity to invest in youth and to reap the benefits if we do. So let me just group a few recommendations and then move on so we can hear from our other speakers. We need to remember to think about youth as multidimensional people, and we need to invest in them in a multidimensional way. First, we need to think of them as students. We need to educate. That means formal schooling, informal schooling, and all the giving youth the skills and the education they need to be effective citizens and effective employees who can provide for themselves and their families. We need to engage them. We need to give youth pathways forward, a chance to harness their talents and their energies, programs of national service, leadership opportunities, opportunities to make a difference in their communities. And lastly, we need to help them with employment. We need not just workforce development and job creation, but also to give people the skills, the education they're going to need in order to succeed in the workforce for many years to come. And as we all know, that is an environment that is changing very, very quickly. So the problem is, though, that right now our efforts are very fragmented. They're wildly, disproportionately small given the scope of the challenges. They are very under-resourced, and so we need a comprehensive strategy with many partners in the public, private, and nonprofit sector. It needs to be global, it needs to be comprehensive, and of course, we need youth themselves at the center playing a very prominent role. So with that, I will close. I hope I have persuaded you, and I look forward to hearing the other panelists. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Kristin. That was tremendous to share the synthesis of the challenges of the secondary impacts and what that may have as not only a short-term, but a very long-term impact on development worldwide. I want to switch over to Nahom now. Nahom, as a young Ethiopian entrepreneur, could you talk a little bit about how the pandemic's affected your work and what kind of resources and opportunities do you and other young entrepreneurs see that we need to rebuild this system? Nahom, you're on mute. If you wouldn't mind taking yourself off mute. There we go.
No, I'm not. No, I'm on mute. Yeah. Thanks, Kristin, for the wonderful presentation, and Mike for the wonderful introduction. Thank you, Making Sense and the Young Economic Opportunities Network for this kind of interesting and insightful meetup. So I'll try to share my insights regarding how the pandemic infected and affected my work, and how me and people at my age are trying to rebuild in order to proceed on their entrepreneurial paths. So I will try to make some bullet points and brief introductions of each. So the first one is the pandemic, as you all may know, make everything uncertain, and it's almost impossible to plan businesses and also other life activities in this uncertain time. So that's the global reality, and the new normal COVID-19 data and enforced us to be in this box, which is full of uncertainties. And this uncertainty is a very challenging fact that we as a youth are facing currently. And we are also facing with very complicated problems even prior to the pandemic, but this pandemic has come and it aggravated those problems like underemployment and unemployment among the youth by being a fuel on the fire. And as you may know, there is a research that which says almost 70% and more of the Ethiopian youth is basically working on the agrarian economy, and this agrarian economy demands some movements in order to trade your products, what you did on your the agrarian activities. And this speaking of this reality, this brought very hazardous economic stagnation among the youth, in addition to the earlier mentioned two problems. And there is also a very big problem related to proceeding to legalization of businesses like startups and small businesses, because as you all may know, the COVID-19 pandemic has restricted the physical movements and redirected our movements into the virtual one. So this is very clear for all of us, and I would like to also raise about the golden opportunity that this pandemic has brought with, and I call it the emerging public space, which is the internet that we are currently discussing on. So we are trying to leverage the capacities, opportunities, and interesting networks that the internet is bringing to us as of COVID-19. So this emerging public space has a very untapped potential in making networks among the youth, in letting the youth to be more accessible and handy for international communications and exchanges of ideas. So the emerging public space is one of the landmark opportunities that we are trying to leverage as of the COVID-19. And from my perspective, I want to suggest some points for the international donors and private sectors, and also young people. I believe young people they have to advocate for youth inclusive decision making. They have to advocate for youth inclusive planning. They have to advocate for assistance for the betterment of social entrepreneurship. And I also believe that we really have to work on accelerator funds and startup introductions for the youth. And also we would like to see better engagement and network with the international community and funders directly with the youth, as that's a bureaucratic disaster loop is very hazardous to directly pin the challenges that the youth is facing. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you so much. Jennifer, we want to move over to USAID now. Over the last 2 years, the missions around the world worked on their new country strategies, only to be disrupted in suddenly the arrival of the pandemic and having us to rethink the entire context. You've led that process to help USAID staff and partners think about how do we now address and pivot to the new context. Can you talk to us a little bit more about how the Over the Horizons process has worked and what that means for opportunities for youth economic opportunity? Thanks.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Mike. It's really great to be here and part of this GYO summit. So thanks so much. And there's never been a time in recent history when this type of discussion around our development priorities has actually been more important. Globally, COVID-19 presents a monumental, multifaceted humanitarian and development challenge with impacts that will stay with us for years to come. We all know that. So when the pandemic hit, USAID responded, of course, to the immediate health needs of our partner countries and communities impacted by COVID. The US Congress sent us $1.3 billion, which we got out into the field right away to respond to the acute health crisis. But we quickly learned that COVID-19 was so much more than a health crisis. It's truly a development and humanitarian crisis, and it required a new way of thinking and doing our work. So while COVID-19 has affected the entire world population, young people are likely to be particularly affected, as we just heard from Kristin and Nahom, considering economic challenges, educational impacts, and social crises triggered by the pandemic. The UN estimates that as of August, more than 1.6 billion students had been affected by school closures in more than 190 countries. And the impact on schooling is particularly concerning because it has the potential to persist even when COVID-19 is long gone. And young people are not just victims of crises, they are potential future leaders in their communities and countries, and they're key partners in response to mitigate the long-term health, education, economic, social, and security ramifications of COVID-19. So USAID focuses on empowering young people and enabling their participation and leadership in pandemic relief and recovery efforts. We focused on that. So as part of the agency's immediate COVID-19 response efforts, we have made key investments in youth-focused activities, such as efforts to expand distance learning and online soft skills to address the needs of the millions of youth who can't go to school. And in Sri Lanka, USAID's Youth Skills Development Entrepreneurship Project, ULEAD, launched the Stay at Home and Learn campaign, an online campaign to encourage youth to use this time productively by building their life and career skills. So within a month, the campaign reached over 1 million youth and encouraged more than 100,000 to regularly engage with ULEAD curated online life skills and career skills development content. So that was great. But while the immediate pandemic response was critical, as we looked ahead to an uncertain future, we knew we had to adapt our policies, our programs, our resources, our operations accordingly to ensure success in the medium to long term, to position USAID for the challenges to come. So we launched Over the Horizon strategic review. We announced it publicly yesterday, and we are rolling it out this week. And it is a data-driven and evidence-based strategic review that allowed us to think critically about how we can continue to meet our mission in the long term. In addition to consulting over 200 data sources, the Over the Horizon team benefited from significant input from USAID staff and external partners through roundtables and engagements. We engaged over 20 missions spanning every region of the globe to integrate that field perspective. And externally, we met with about 75 different organizations, including Kristin's, and met with about 150 implementing partners, stakeholders through that effort. And from this, we now have a set of actionable recommendations and focus countries working to support 3 objectives, and I'll just outline them here. So the first objective we're focusing on is building resilience in fragile countries that are further weakened by COVID-19. The second one is addressing the significant backsliding on food security, education, and poverty reduction due to the pandemic. And then third, strengthening our public and private health systems and global health security strained, very much impacted by COVID-19. So our Over the Horizon review considered the impact and tremendous effect it's having on youth. And the recommendations do take an integrated approach to considering those impacts on the marginalized and the vulnerable populations, such as women and girls. And for example, to address the pandemic's severe impacts on education, we'll prioritize education plans, tools, training, digital solutions, so learners are safe, well, and learning despite the shocks and stressors related to COVID-19. This will include activities such as assisting our partner governments to plan and finance education and workforce needs for the digital economy of the future, and ensuring marginalized populations can continue learning safely by investing in those digital tools and remote accelerated learning. We'll also advocate with our host governments and other donors for the participation and leadership of women and young people in pandemic recovery efforts, and expand those partnerships with local women-led and youth-focused organizations that are working to address the impacts of COVID-19. So our plans are geared toward reducing inequality, such as bridging the digital divide, which we know pose tremendous risk to access to online learning and does prevent innovations such as digital healthcare solutions. But digital transformation is also an opportunity, which is why we will orient USAID's assistance toward digital development for greater access and efficiencies as countries build and plan for those future shocks. But while we have a strong plan in place, as we look ahead to the implementation phase of Over the Horizon, we know that we cannot do it alone. It'll take an entire development community and strong partnerships with the private sector to meet the demands of an evolved global context. And we must also ensure authentic engagement with youth and emerging young leaders as we pivot and align our programming to meet these challenges. After all, it is youth and young entrepreneurs who have a keen understanding of the digital environment and the opportunities it presents. Aren't young people more flexible and adaptable to the changing contexts? So one thing is certain, although Over the Horizon implementation plans will place youth front and center, we will continue to engage youth as our partners to help us meet the challenges and opportunities in that world altered by COVID-19, which we'll all be living with for quite some time. So I think I'll leave it there. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Jennifer. Jesse, from the perspective of, as Jennifer was mentioning, it's taking these variety of public and private partnerships. Can you talk a little bit about, in the context of Kenya, how you've been working both through Pong Industries as well as through the Chamber of Commerce and the National Committee for Youth and Business to really change that model based on the response to COVID?
All right, thank you very much, Mike. First of all, I will speak on behalf of myself as an entrepreneur, representing the private sector, and also on behalf of KNCCI, which is a private sector advocacy body. And also, I guess, being a techie, my views may be slightly biased towards that. So at the beginning of the pandemic, we as KNCCI, Youth in Business, did a survey of the biggest challenges being faced by young entrepreneurs as a result of the pandemic. And some of the three major challenges we saw was number one, ability to pay existing obligations. Which revolving around financial, that's rent, loans, salaries, things like that. Number two was access to markets. And then number three was travel restrictions, just surely because a lot of locations we couldn't move around, I guess, due to government restrictions. So for example, even let me give a personal example in my company. We could no longer afford to pay our existing loans. We had to restructure with our existing financial institutions. We had to rethink our staff, and also we had to renegotiate our rent. So that's just a personal example of what we went through during the COVID crisis as it hit. But then again, some of these measures are not enough. These are just, these are stopgaps. The real issue is actually our business models. Our markets and the skills that we have can no longer work in a COVID-19 world. So let me give an example of the kind of skills and innovation that we need at this point of time. And moving on forward for sustainability. In my neighborhood, there's an open air food market called Kangemi Market. Those who have been to Kenya know that you can get one of the freshest veggies and groceries from there. So as the pandemic hit, movement restrictions mandated by the government kicked in immediately. Markets are forced to close. And well, because of social distancing is in such a densely populated area, there's definitely no way that people could, go to the market as usual. So yeah, this is going somewhere. So I came across this lady who mentioned to me she had lost her job working in a restaurant and resorted to selling veggies from the Kangemi market. But here's how she did it. She sends a list either daily or weekly to her prospective customers via WhatsApp of what is currently fresh in the market. And then the people make orders via WhatsApp and she delivers straight to your door or home. This is a model. Hello, sorry, I think I got lost a bit.
We can hear you now, Jesse, go ahead.
All right, wonderful, no worries. Yeah, so I was saying, this is a model that has been replicated by several other young entrepreneurs in the country. I mean, even closer to home, for example, even my sister, an amazing person, but she was affected by the inability to go to the market to buy fresh produce for her family. So what does she do? She gets together with like-minded people and, they're able to start an e-commerce or create an e-commerce site that they're able to sell fresh tomatoes and onions to a doorstep. So what I like about these ideas is some of them are actually very low-tech. For example, that lady who was selling at the market, who basically was selling through WhatsApp. Can you imagine if she was skilled up, okay, in case she got any sort of tech skills so that she could be able to upscale whatever it is she's doing, bring together all various other sellers from the market to come together and sell via e-commerce to other people. So you can imagine, even with such low tech, they're still able to handle, resilience during a COVID crisis like this. So I really found that amazing. I mean, also look at myself, for example, Pong agencies. We can no longer go to our customers and they can no longer come to us. So right now we're therefore in the process of developing a unique site positioned to be the next biggest e-commerce site in Kenya for technology devices and products. So to sum this up, with just a little push, we can increase the number of similar success stories like this in Kenya and beyond. Thus improving livelihoods of several people in our communities and improving our nation's economic output. I mean, if you look at Kenya, for example, those of you who've known about M-Pesa, it's mobile money, with the kind of mobile money that's used within our country. And if you look at our mobile penetration rate, we're at probably over 100%. So with just a little extra push, including now the capacities that we have with mobile money, I think improving our digital skills would go a really, really long way. So for example, at KNCCI Youth in Business, we are working towards developing a program to enable young entrepreneurs to take their businesses online. This will empower the youth with, number one, digital skills, which young people can easily learn and adapt to. So number two, we're also working towards creating a marketplace or a platform to showcase what the best Kenyans have to offer in terms of products and services, of course, with a focus on young entrepreneurs. Then number three, champion for easier access to affordable internet and devices. So more or less like a call to action now is youth employment is a problem in Kenya, and I guess at the world beyond, especially right now. I would therefore like to urge the community at large to give young people a chance. They are smart, they are educated, they are tech savvy. And I think, in fact, the previous speaker talked something along those lines about young people being very tech savvy. And we are the ones, or young people are the ones to help navigate the world at large, actually, Africa and the world at large out of this pandemic to a much brighter and more prosperous future. So I think some of the direct things that we can do, and the donor community and also government at large as a society together, private sector can be able to do, are things like, number one, funding the young entrepreneurs or funding young people's ideas, funding the youth's ideas. The youth are very innovative, okay, and they have a whole lot of information accessible to them. I mean, look at millennials right now. Millennials right now are probably the generation with the most, I wouldn't say the smartest, but perhaps the smartest, but have been able to get the most information at their fingertips. So if the ideas are funded, they'll be able to go very far. I think number two is basically digital skills. Let us empower our youth with digital skills. Okay, let's give them the skills to be able to make the business, to bring up the businesses online. And then number three, let's hold real partnerships. Okay, let's work together with the youth in terms of policy, in terms of working with them to be able to ensure a lot of it, they're there on the same table with decision makers. Then number four, let's also remember those who have been forgotten, the young people who've been forgotten. Right now, we've got a lot of young people who, for example, in Kenya, who are unable to get to high school or get a secondary school education. We have got those who are unable to get to university. And for that reason, they are forced actually into entrepreneurship. So how are we going to be able to work with these young people? Okay, because now all of a sudden in entrepreneurship, so how do we upskill them? Okay, how do we enable them to be functioning members of society, and also for them to be able to feed their families? And because if we don't do that, in all honesty, we do feel like it's a crisis awaiting to happen. And then I guess my last point is also, as a donor community, as a government, and also private sector, let's create an enabling environment. And being a tech player, I think one of the best enabling environments we can create is through digital inclusion. Okay, let's try and ensure that the internet, for example, people have access to internet, have access to devices, and this is throughout the globe in areas, areas outside of urban areas. This means that it can be a catalyst for change and a catalyst for great economic growth if that is sorted through digital inclusion. So yeah, I think those are the points that I have. Thank you.
That is a important and a very tall agenda. And as I was in the breakout room before, in the session before on scaling up, the only way we've seen really effective scale up over time is private sector or public public-private sector. So would welcome right now to hear a little bit more from the perspective of the Youth Employment Funders Group and Citi Foundation. Florencia, could you talk to us about how do we align those efforts and resources in a meaningful way? because it has to go beyond where we've been if we really are going to tackle the size of the problem that we're currently looking at. Florencia?
Sure, thank you, Mike. And thank you everyone for this opportunity to contribute to this conversation. I'm going to be focusing on my observations and perspective as a funder, as well as a member of the Youth Employment Funders Group. So for many of you that may not be as familiar with, this group is actually made up of over 30 multilateral and international funders, and really this group exists solely to collaborate in addressing the youth employment challenge in a more coordinated and effective manner. The group does this on 3 fronts, and I'll be very quick. Knowledge sharing, so as you can imagine, webinars, newsletters, roundtables, and so forth. Knowledge generation, so we commission research and tools and other kind of resources for the field at large. And knowledge amplification, so we directly connect funders with each other to create new partnerships and new synergies in the sector. And in this unprecedented moment in time that we're all living through, has really created unprecedented momentum and urgency for this type of funder alignment and collaboration. The funders group has been working to share information, and we are exploring how together we could best support young people navigate the employment challenges they're facing, both in the immediate as well as throughout the economic recovery phase that's yet to come. This crisis has highlighted many challenges we're all familiar with, and which many of my colleagues have already mentioned, right? That no sector can do it alone, that young people are disproportionately impacted in time, particularly in times of crisis, and that young people have been consistently, I want to say, systematically left out of building and leading those very programs that are set up to impact their lives. These topics are not easy for us all, any of us to navigate, right? How and when to cooperate versus collaborate. What do we actually mean by youth voice and engagement? How do we fix those very systems that are producing these negative and disparate impacts? On the topic of youth voice and engagement in particular, we have actually commissioned Plan International to research and develop a roadmap that will identify how young people's voices and agencies can feature throughout the life cycle of a funding opportunity. And by life cycle, what we mean here is from program design to implementation, to monitoring, to governance, to evaluation. As everybody has mentioned in one shape or form, young people are mobilizing, they are innovating, they are delivering solutions in their communities. And it's really all of our loss if this power and agency, their voice and ideas aren't present and center stage, a word that many of you use, as we navigate this future ahead of us. This research and roadmap will be publicly available, of course, in a few months, but I'd like to share a couple of points that I've learned so far. The first is the importance of defining what youth engagement and voice actually means in practical terms. And at its core, we've seen that it requires participation, partnerships, and the establishment of equitable power relations. The second observation I'll make is that while more research will be required to really quantify the impact of youth engagement on direct employment outcomes, we already know that work that does not include meaningful engagement doesn't or will not live up to its full potential. So with that in mind, and taking what I just heard from Jesse and from others, this is my call to action, particularly perhaps for funders. While we should always strive to do more, we also need to do things differently. We have a unique opportunity right now to evolve how we engage young people in our funding life cycle. And I truly believe that the steps to create this change doesn't have to be difficult. Actions such as leveraging youth experts or refining the questions you have in your application or ensuring that there's diversity amongst the youth focus groups that you've already engaged, those are just a few examples of these steps. And on the surface, these actions may actually be seem deceivingly small, but make no mistake, they're incredibly powerful steps if we are to move closer to a more equitable youth employment sector. So I know I kept it short because I know there's a lot more to have in this conversation, but thank you all for this opportunity, and let me turn it back to Mike.
Thank you so much. That was tremendous. Really appreciate the insightful remarks of each of our panelists. Right now, we want to go to the room and get some questions from the room. Actually, you just answered one of the early questions is, how are donors getting beyond donor competition to donor coordination? So I want to go to a second question, which is, it seems that there's still a lot of talk about, but not sufficient real investment. Sorry for my camera. There we go. It seems that there's still more talk, but not sufficient real investment in youth programming and coordination. How will you each work to improve additional investment in the youth field and measure that improvement? Jennifer, maybe we could start with you on that one.
Sure. Okay. Absolutely. So I think actually USAID will spend about $300 million on youth-related programming in 2020, as well as a substantial amount via the PEPFAR Dreams initiative across Africa. But I think we really need, I mean, that is critically important, but we also need, I think, to look at youth the way we're now looking, including women in so much of what we do. Youth should be inherent in all of donor programming and multilateral programming, in my opinion. It's not just its own thing where we just focus on the youth, and we certainly can do that, but it should be inclusive of every program that we address. If we're looking at women, if we're looking at young boys, if we're looking at youth as a whole, if we're looking at entrepreneurs, if we're looking at government, bureaucrats who've been there for 15 years, how do they get to the next level? It should really be inclusive in all of the programming that we do. And that is the approach we took to our Over the Horizon effort, and including youth in most of our recommendations moving forward. Over.
Excellent. Other thoughts from other of the panelists? How do we really make sure that we're putting the resources there? There's been a growing consensus that it's important. And I think, Kristin, you touched upon this when you interviewed the leaders of development agencies, that this is the most under-resourced priority in development. And that came from 96 different development leaders. How else can we think about getting to that better level of investment? What needs to change?
Well, I think one thing I'll give props to USAID for, and at IREX we're proud to partner with you on it, is the Youth Excel initiative. And one of the many elements of Youth Excel is to, first of all, invest directly in youth organizations, youth-led organizations around the world, which I think is really important. The other thing is to give youth and youth serving organizations the skills to use data and research, and give them their own data and research that they can bring to donors and make their case. And I think this helps to address that power differential that was mentioned before, to give them, to help them make the case more strongly, and basically to level the playing field when competing with other organizations for funds and for resources. I think those are a couple of steps that will really help, and hopefully we'll be seeing some movement on that in the months and even weeks ahead.
Excellent. I want to jump to this question from Hannah Sahatkia from Generation Unlimited. She says, it's great to see how several agencies and organizations are agreeing that young people should be engaged in a 360-degree approach to young people, to youth programming. But I'd be curious to hear about a best practice on how the panelists' organizations are engaging young people meaningfully in the governance structure as we look at issues of youth economic opportunity. Would any of the panelists like to respond to how you're authentically bringing in young people into the governance of your organizations? Nahom?
Yeah, I want to share my insight here. I work as a youth advisor for the government of UK in Ethiopia. And working on that point, we advise, challenge, and promote the programs, the basic programs and strategies of the government of UK in Ethiopia, in which at least we feel we are influencing decision making and policy making through advising the government of UK in Ethiopia. As we may know, the government of UK in Ethiopia is doing so many interesting things and the strategic things in transforming the availability of economic opportunities for the baby boom generation in Ethiopia, the youth in general. And I personally think, speaking from the side of the private sector and also as a young entrepreneur, we should basically advocate, engage, and give a chance for the baby boom generation to have its own say for different challenges and opportunities which could arise from itself. And through advocating, we can have a better inclusive policies. We can have a good infrastructure for the social entrepreneurship sector, which is a very saving sector for the contemporary problems that we are facing in general. And we should also have to engage on policy and decision-making discourses and debates. And also we should feel and we should also lead through advocating for basically use leadership and economic opportunity for the youth specifically. Thank you.
Thank you. Florencia, I know you've done a lot of thinking on this as well. And in the Padlet, we are seeing some of the people posting their responses to the 2 questions. Remember, you can be writing in the Padlet right now your responses to our questions. But the one listener said, we have to listen and educate international development funders, private sector and implementers about hiring people who reflect young people being served and listening to young people. How are you doing it at your organization and through the funders group? How are we really getting young people into governance positions?
I think it's a good question, and it comes to the heart, right? When you talk about governance, it comes to the heart of where that power dynamic sits at times. It's more visual there. It is step by step. It's incremental. So I can't stand here or sit here and say that we have it all right and that we're doing exactly what we should be. We're taking incremental steps, and I think all funders, well, I can't speak for all funders, but at least from my perspective, incremental steps are needed, and we need to accelerate those steps. So reflecting not just in our own institutions, but also in terms of those who we fund, right? And it doesn't necessarily, I think we have to be careful not to kind of disrupt the system, but but change it, right? In terms of governance. So I don't think stepping back, I think the first step is asking the right questions. So in your funding relationships and how you engage with grantees and organizations, start asking those questions about their governance structure, about how they view power dynamics, how do they engage young people, how reflective and diverse are those voices. Those lessons then you can bring back into your own institution and also make changes in your own governance structure. So I think it's going to be incremental and it will take time, but we have started by asking questions, listening, learning, using the tools we have, and starting to make those changes over time.
Great, thanks. A question that came from Rachel Sirkin. Question for the entire panel. Sarita and Asher earlier talked about the theme of how donors and international organizations can both support scalable programs and then get out of the way. And in the breakout room, Larry Cooley had talked about abandoning the project mentality for scale. So what does get out of the way mean for each of you? How do we get out of the way in a way that we're also ensuring that we're supporting the long-term development of youth-led enterprise, social or economic? Jesse, do you want to kick it off?
Thank you. It's getting a bit chilly here, so I'm wearing one of my favorite blankets. That's a great question, actually. So for example, at CAN-CCI, what we've done is there's been a very intentional effort to put youth within the higher level management within the organization, within the structures. So for example, CAN-CCI is our Chamber of Commerce, and in every county, there's a board. Within every county in Kenya, there's a different board together with management and a secretariat that runs it. So within each board, you also have a representative from the youth, okay, which is very, very key, because that means that we're actually able to, give a certain level of empowerment now from a devolved way to the young people. So now, even moving on further, even as each of those young board representatives are able to operate, they're also able to start their own programs and run it on their own. So that means even from the higher level, they're able to give them an opportunity to be able to run their own show, for example. So I think that's one of the key things, just being able to actually trust and empower young people. And I think that's something that has not been there. A lot of times, you know, it's like a father and his son, for example, okay? A father will allow his child to, you know, should be able to allow his child to make some certain mistakes, because that's the only way to learn. But if they don't do that, then they'll never learn, and they'll be forever tied at the hip to their father. So I think that's one of the key things that some of the organizations should be able to do. Just, you know, let go of that control and just allow the young people to be able to make their mistakes, to be able to learn, to grow. And that's how they're able to actually champion for the challenges that they're seeking to champion. Hope that answers the question.
Thank you. So we're moving into our final 5 minutes. I want to give each of the speakers 30 to 60 seconds to kind of wrap up. What is that call to action? What is that thing that people from any government level or private sector partners that we're working with that maybe don't get youth and youth economic opportunity yet, other branches of our donor agency or youth networks that we work with, what is it? What is our call to action, or that one takeaway message which everybody has to understand? And I will start with Jennifer.
Sorry, can you hear? Yeah. I think I would say, think about youth in every program that you set out to do. What is the impact? How can we engage them more? And Kristin had set out something: educate, engage, and employ. To me, probably the most important thing is engagement, mentorship, showing them the way and providing those role models and seeing what they can potentially achieve.
Awesome, thank you. Kristin.
Thanks, Mike. I would echo what Jennifer said and say to think about the impact on youth for all programs, but in doing so, also think about youth as whole people. You know, we tend to think about youth as employees or as citizens or as students or as patients in the healthcare system, but actually youth are very complex people like all of us, and we need to engage the whole person. And when we're thinking about investing them, that means focusing on also cross-cutting skills, leadership skills, digital literacy skills, data skills, those things that can help youth perform in all of their roles and with all of their identities. I think we could do a much better job of looking across the board and thinking in a comprehensive and cross-cutting way.
Thank you. Nahom.
Yes, Mike. I basically have 5 different pointers as final call for action. The first one is we really have to engage youth on key decision and policy makings, and we have to really advocate for better use inclusive economic policies, for better engagements, and also use interface with funders more directly, and also better engagement of use with decision making posts and governments and also private sectors. And we really have to lower barriers for them to for us to access capitals and get businesses off the ground. And also we want to start businesses, and as you may know, the things are not smooth as we may think. So we really need to lower barriers, and we have to let them network with the international community through peer networks, through incubation programs, access information and enlightening programs to exchanging programs to. And we really have to help secondary students and university graduates in helping them to be capacitated with the necessary soft skill introduction in their education stages.
Thank you. Florencia.
I will echo what everybody has already said. Youth not as recipients, youth as partners. And just to add one more thing, also in terms of the lessons we learn from young people back into the organization. So it's not a one-way street.
And then Jesse, final thought.
Yeah, just to echo what everyone else has also said, I guess. Yeah, this is not the time to neglect the youth. This is the time to actually give them the skills, empower them, and help them to grow and run and empower in whichever spheres they're at. So let's not neglect them. Let's give them, some space so that they can be able to grow, learn, and make a change in our environment and in our economies. Yeah.
Thank you, Jesse, and thanks to all of you. I would tend to agree. I think we are reaching an inflection point in the international development community where that level of recognition of the role of youth and the disproportionate impact of things like a pandemic on their secondary impacts of them is at a key point. And breaking through what I would call the choir and getting out to the much broader audience, we're leveraging the potential of 1.2 billion young people to be partners on specific areas of food security and reversing now what is going on with livelihoods and the slipping back into extreme poverty or resurgent authoritarianism or different ways that we can look at a digital economy is a key opportunity for everyone to understand, and not as a rhetorical, yes, we need to think about and engage youth. So I think if there is any small silver lining to the last 9 months, we've seen a transformation in models of learning for soft skills and social emotional skills and foundational skills with distance and online learning. We've seen digital finance transform the way that young entrepreneurs can access that. We're looking at new ways that young people are seeing their role in food security and food systems. And I was really impressed when I was listening to the folks from Harambe talking about how they created listening circles and reached over 8.9 million people to really think about what they needed to change, or how Banyan Global in Honduras with Empleando Futuros used biosafety approaches for a need-based value approach, a value-add approach. So I think the field is progressing, but the challenge ahead of us is massive, and it takes this collective reimagination. So I thank each and every one of you, the presenters. I especially thank Making Sense every year for bringing this space together. And I turn it back to Tim for closing us out.
Great. Thank you again, Mike, for guiding today's conversation, and to all of our speakers for taking the time to share their perspectives with us. Thanks to Kristin Lorde, Florencia Spangaro, Jesse Muraya, Jennifer Arangio, and Nahom Teklu. Each one of you has brought a unique insight as implementers, advocates, funders, and business leaders. And we thank you for challenging all of us to think about how we can build stronger, more inclusive systems for youth economic opportunities. Before we officially close the GYEO Summit for 2020, I want to extend a special thanks to our GYEO sponsors who helped make this year's virtual series possible. USAID, who also sponsored this roundtable, MTC, Chemonics, FHI 360, and the Adventure Travel and Trade Association, and Save the Children for contributing to our technical track events this year and to today's events through the breakout sessions. Also, thank you to IREX for sponsoring this morning's Generation to Generation Fireside Chat. But our summit partners don't just provide financial support to put on this annual event. They provide a direct hand in shaping the summit's learning agenda, and they work with our team as content partners and thought leaders. All of us have had to adapt our work to this new online format and to the summit, and the summit partners have been both patient and a pleasure to work with as we try to pivot the summit in 2020. The recording from today's event will be online at www.youtheosummit.org, and you can also follow us at YouthEconOps for a post-event summary and for updates about our plans for the 2021 GYEO Summit in October of next year. As always, if you'd like to learn more about the summit and partner with us, please don't hesitate to reach out. I also need to thank the Making Sense staff who helped organize and put on this event, especially Sarah Slayton and Cole Simcoe, as well as Eva Gloria Thomas, Alex and Temi on our comms team. Thank you all. For now, we thank you all, the participants, for joining us and hope you all stay healthy and safe in the months ahead. And finally, for the US citizens amongst us, please vote next week. Take care, everyone. Thank you. Have a great rest of your day.